The oven clicked off before the cookies were properly golden. Gabriela lifted the tray with an oven mitt that had seen better seasons and squinted at the cookies' uneven edges. One patch of them was a little charred, another still soft in the center. Anne stood on a chair by the counter, humming a tuneless carol and watching her mother as if the way Gabriela moved could be a lesson in small miracles. Outside, the city exhaled a soft, cold breath. Condensation freckled the window pane where Anne had traced a star with a smudged finger. It was Christmas Eve, and the apartment smelled of butter and a faint, stubborn hint of smoke. Gabriela smoothed her hair back with the heel of her hand and tried not to count expenses she could not afford. The electric bill envelope, folded under a cookbook, stared up at her from the table like an accusation. The tiny tree in the corner wore a string of bulbs that blinked more cheerfully than they had any right to. Ornaments were mismatched, some store-bought years ago, some crafted from felt by Anne's small, diligent hands. There was a dent in the radiator that rattled at night, a patch of plaster by the doorway always damp in winter, a stubborn leak in the sink they'd patched with tape until new tape ran out. Yet when Anne reached to pluck one of the slightly burnt cookies and offered it to Gabriela with the solemnity of offering treasure, Gabriela felt something steadier than fear, a fierce private love that would not let her abandon the life she'd built. Anne's voice rang out plain and urgent. "Mama, will Daddy come for Christmas?" Gabriela's fingers tightened on the cookie tray. She had learned over the years how to keep certain answers in the safe where they wouldn't be asked to go on display. She had learned to say gentle truths that were also shields. "There's no Daddy today, baby," she told Anne, trying to fold the ache into a smile. "But we have each other. We'll make it the best Christmas." Anne looked unconvinced. She tilted her head, eyes the clear blue of someone waiting for the rest of the story. "But Mr. Thompson down the hall said Santa brings presents to children with Daddy. He said it's easier when you have a family." The little sentence fell between them like brittle glass. Gabriela told herself Mr. Thompson hadn't meant it unkindly. He was lonely and liked to imagine neat explanations. She wiped a smear of icing from Anne's cheek and gathered the small, precise courage that filled most of her days. "Santa brings presents whether you have a family or not," she said. It sounded thin to her own ears, but Anne smiled as if whatever Gabriela chose to say right then would be true enough. Gabriela wanted, for Anne, the untroubled certainty of a child's faith. She wanted for herself the soft illusion that the world could be made right with a ribbon and a song. But the oven was a reminder of the day's practicalities, the tips not quite adding up. The design brief she had postponed because a new late-night shift at the cafe meant sleep was a rare commodity. The small payment she'd arranged with careful apologies. She had learned to manage the grinding arithmetic of survival, but she had not learned to stop the hollow feeling that rose sometimes in a quiet hour, a question of whether quiet would ever become something else. Before the melancholy could settle too deeply, Gabriela straightened. "Come on," she said, brushing flour off her palms. "Let's get your doll dressed and the tree lit. We'll make a list for Santa, okay?" Anne cheered as if all was settled. She bounded across the apartment, grabbed a ragged felt doll from beneath a cushion, and presented it as though a coronation were at hand. Gabriela watched the small ceremony and felt a fragile warmth gather. If you're with me for this little story tonight, stay to the end. Subscribe and like if this warms your heart, and share what Christmas has meant to you in the comments. It helps others find stories like this. The square was a different world from Gabriela's narrow street. It had been dressed for the season with the seriousness of a place trying to convince everyone that joy might be possible. A fir 3 times as tall as the neighborhood's buildings rose in the center, its ornaments shining like promises. On previous winters, Gabriela had been content to walk past with Anne tucked warm against her side. This year, Anne insisted on seeing the lights up close, on hearing the carolers count the night aloud. They arrived when snow was just beginning to settle in thin flakes that immediately softened the edges of the city. People clustered near the tree. Families, couples, a few solitary figures whose breath puffed out little ghosts. A man in a red costume posed for pictures with children, pretending to be something that needed pretending. A pianist in a booth played theme songs from old holiday films. The notes hung in the air like tiny bright things. Anne's hand was warm in Gabriela's when a gust lifted a flurry into their faces. Gabriela kept her scarf tugged up to her chin and counted the cost in calories of every step they took toward the tree. She tried to be present, to see through Anne's brightness without letting herself drift into longing. But when the tree's lights blinked on and a small gasp rose from the crowd, something that was almost like permission loosened inside her. Anne clapped and then reached for Gabriela's coat with both small fists. That was when a commotion near the base of the tree sent people stepping back to give space. A toddler, slipping from his mother's grip, had skidded on the frozen stone. Without thinking, the man nearest them moved. He was taller than most, broad at the shoulders, in a coat that looked as if it cost more than Gabriela's rent. He swept the child up in one practiced motion, his gloves soft with manners. He didn't glance at the mother as though seeking reward. He only returned the child to her arms with an inclination of the head. People murmured their appreciation. The mother thanked him with a flustered smile. Anne's eyes were generous and immediate. "Look, Mama," she said, "he's like a knight." Gabriela's own look was more cautious. The man's presence felt like a note struck in a key she didn't recognize. It made the surrounding din hush in a way that made Gabriela glance at their shoes to check their reality. He noticed them then, noticed the smallness of Anne craning to see the tree, the way Gabriela's coat was a size too small. He stepped closer in a way that was not obtrusive but attentive, as if he were reading the room for cues. "Would you like to see the lights from up close?" he asked, his voice smooth, familiar without being invasive. There was an accent, the careful cadence of someone used to being listened to. He offered his hand as if he were offering the smallest of favors. Anne's confidence was an immediate yes. She reached out and took it. The man bent, and for a second, Gabriela saw Anne perched like a bird on his shoulders, tiny hands patting a head of salt and pepper hair. The crowd smiled. A few people snapped photos. Anne laughed, a clear bell sound, and the man's face, usually set, it seemed, into an expression of practiced neutrality, opened. He introduced himself when Gabriela stepped forward. "Thales," he said, as if giving his name to someone whose daily life he did not assume to share. He had the kind of smile that made a space feel less like an obstacle and more like a possibility. "Gabriela," she answered with her last name attached out of habit, the way one attaches a coat when the air is sharp. She said Anne's name too, and Anne, thrilled and emboldened, demanded of him exactly the sort of impossible thing children sometimes do. "Mr. Thales," she said, solemn as a judge, "will you be my dad tonight?" Gabriela felt the blood leave her face, and then, almost as quickly, a ridiculous flare of protective humor. "Anne," she said, half laughing, half firm, "we don't ask grown men to be dads in public." Thales laughed with genuine amusement, not mockery. He looked at Gabriela as if acknowledging both the joke and the yearning behind it. "I'd be honored to be your stand-in dad," he told Anne, leaning down to meet her eyes. "For tonight only, unless I do a very good job." Anne took this as a contract and nodded solemnly. Gabriela's mouth opened, closed. There was a quick exchange, Thales asking if Anne had any allergies, Gabriela talking with practiced breeziness about peanut-free snacks, and then Thales offering to walk them to a place nearby where they could warm up, to buy Anne hot cocoa. The offer felt like a small, improbable mercy. Gabriela hesitated because she always hesitated. She was not blind to the gulf between the man's tailored coat and her threadbare mittens. She had a defensive pride that had kept her upright for years. But then she looked at Anne's face, high on the man's shoulders, and saw only devotion shining there. That image, Anne's unguarded trust, pushed her to accept. They found a cafe across the square with a window rimed in frost and a stove that hummed like a contented animal. The matron, a man named Andre who presided with kind exactitude, led them to a corner table where a candle fluttered behind glass. Thales ordered cocoa with a careful eye to Anne's declared wishes, topped with whipped cream and a little candy cane, said with the sincerity people reserve for small indulgences. He ordered a simple soup for Gabriela, nothing flamboyant, but perfect, rich with root vegetables and nerves of rosemary. The menu he placed in front of Gabriela was not an offer to purchase. It was a gentle rearrangement of the night's plan. They talked across the small island of the table, and the conversation moved in an odd, comfortable rhythm. Thales asked the small, unobtrusive questions people use to form maps of strangers. A city they lived in, a job they liked, a place they remembered fondly. He did so with an attentive precision that felt like a mirror rather than interrogation. Gabriela answered with practiced brevity at first, an automatic front of modesty and caution, and then loosened into a narrative she had not meant to return to the public sphere. How she worked shifts at the cafe and took night classes in design because the world of posters and colors calmed her. How Anne loved trains and had an intense devotion to building things from cardboard. "And you?" Gabriela asked, turning the question back to him with the small, assessing curiosity of someone who had not expected anything from a stranger and therefore could afford to notice. Thales folded his napkin with a deliberateness that looked like ritual. "I run a company," he said. The words were simple, and Gabriela could see from the way he said them that they carried more than the meaning of work. He was used to managing things. Figures, people, expectations. He used the same lightness of voice to speak of that as he had used to lift Anne onto his shoulders moments before. But there were edges to his sentences where vulnerability stuck like burrs. He told, in small, careful details, of living alone because his last partnership had dissolved in ways that left him wary. Not bitter exactly, but cautious. He had learned, he said, how to be efficient with his time and exact with his charity, but not how to be tender when it counted. Gabriela watched the way he sat, the way his watch caught the candlelight, a bright, clinical flash, and considered what prudence required of her. He was a stranger with the trappings of a different life, and yet his gestures were careful and unobtrusive. He listened as if words were precious. For the first time in a long while, she felt the brittle armor of cynicism soften, if just a fraction. Here was someone who had the means to change certain facts, piping that had been broken, a heater that coughed in winter. Yet he remained on the same level as other patrons in the restaurant, considerate of Anne's whims and keenly present. Anne, taking advantage of adult conversational openings, asked an unvarnished question that only children seem capable of. "Do you have a train?" she asked, eyes wide. The smallness of her want made Gabriela's chest ache. She had been delaying the purchase of anything non-essential for months. Trains, they could be patient about. Yet Anne fixed her with the kind of pleading that amounts to the best kind of persuasion. Thales looked at Gabriela, and there was an honest, almost anxious hesitation in his face. There was no grand gesture, no envelope pushed across the table. Instead, his answer was quiet and sensible. "If you'd like, I can ask Andre where there might be a small toy shop open tonight," he said. "We can see what's possible." Gabriela's first instinct was refusal. She had grown wary of favors that came with margins. But the offer needed no return. It had the feel of genuine goodwill. And the way his eyes met hers, steady, respectful, suggested he did not assume that his means gave him a right to rewrite other people's lives. "Only if you're sure," she said. "We don't want you spending too much." He cut her off kindly. "It's a small thing," he said. "Consider it a holiday exchange. I'll not call it a debt." That night, as they walked back across streets that reflected lamplight like a second sky, Gabriela watched Thales as if studying a small animal to see whether it would reveal its true nature. He was careful not to loom over Anne, except when he offered an elbow for warmth. He addressed Gabriela with a frankness that carried neither pity nor condescension. They talked about their childhood holidays and clipped episodes. A father who had been there for some of Gabriela's early years, but who had chosen a different path. A childhood for Thales that had been steady on the surface, yet quiet at home. Both hinted at absences without dramatizing them.
They parted at the bus stop nearest Gabriela's building. Anne, bodiless with delight, clutched a small, perfectly wrapped parcel that Andre had found in a neighboring shop, a miniature wooden train painted red with tiny brass wheels. She insisted it was the most wonderful thing in the world, as if she had been given the sun. Gabriela thanked Thales for the evening, for the cocoa, for the small kindness of company. Thales hesitated as if deciding whether to offer more. Then, with the awkward generosity of someone unused to intimate,
"Exits," he said. If you and Anne ever want to have dinner again, I will be around in the afternoons. I'm in the neighborhood sometimes for work. No pressure." Gabriela felt the old automatic defiance rise, the walls that had kept men at distance, the stubborn belief that she must do everything alone. But Anne's small voice, already practicing the new language of hope, tugged her. "Will you come on Christmas morning?" the child asked, unabashed and bold. Gabriela looked at Thales, and then at Anne, and finally at herself, as if searching for permission she'd misplaced. Something in Thales's expression, a simple, clear agreement, made her realize that this evening was not an intrusion, but a small detonation of possibility. He did not promise forever, did not make grand vows. He simply said, "I'll come for lunch, if that's all right." That answer settled like a warm shawl over something that had been chilled. Gabriela agreed, more to Anne than to him, to the idea of a lunch that would be ordinary and new at the same time. She allowed herself, for a few minutes on that freckled bus stop, to imagine a day where there were 3 chairs at a table. Back in the apartment, the radiator hummed, and Anne bounded in with her train, arranging it on their small coffee table as if the new object had already altered the geometry of their home. Gabriela boiled water and brewed tea the way someone performs an old liturgy. The kettle's whistle was a small domestic bell. She watched Anne tuck the train under her arm like a secret and then proceed to nestle the doll under her chin. The apartment felt, for the first time in a long stretch of nights, coaxed into a kind of peace. Before they ate the late, simple dinner Gabriela had prepared, Thales called to confirm his plan for the next day. His voice on the phone was steady and attentive. He asked if there was anything they needed, if there was an address for the place he should come to. Gabriela, unused to such straightforward offers, felt both grateful and mildly embarrassed, as if accepting a hand that might later expect to be held. On Christmas morning, Thales arrived with no fanfare. He walked up the stairs carrying a small parcel that looked like it could have been chosen by someone who had watched Anne for a short time and listened carefully to what she loved. He brought with him a brooch, a simple star-shaped pin made of bronze, not expensive in a way that required boasting, but thoughtful in a way that suggested attention. He presented it to Gabriela with a note that said nothing she would later recall in full, but she remembered the way his fingers trembled fractionally as he fastened it to the lapel of her coat. "For a light you keep in a small place," he said. It was not a line of poetry so much as a literal assessment that felt like validation. They ate lunch at a small bistro with steamed vegetables and a pie that flaked apart like memory. Anne chattered about the train, making tracks across the table with the spoon. Andre, who had arranged the toy delivery the night before, appeared to say hello as if he had become invested in their small constellation. In that room, with light filtered through old glass and a piano murmuring in the corner, normality felt bright and not precarious. Then Anne, stubborn and brave, turned to Thales and fixed him with the clear-eyed seriousness of a judge. "Will you be my daddy today?" she asked again, formal as a contract. Thales's smile widened. "I will," he said, and it felt like a statement neither frivolous nor final. He crouched to meet Anne eye to eye, and for a moment the 3 of them stood there outside of their separate histories, linked by a tiny, fragile covenant. There were 1,000 ways the afternoon could have gone wrong. Gabriela's distrust could have reasserted itself and put distance between them. Social differences could have oiled the hinge of embarrassment. The unspoken questions, what did this mean, what would it cost, could have heaved them back into solitude. Instead, what happened felt more like a negotiation toward the future. Thales asked permission to help with certain things,
Small repairs around the apartment he noticed were frayed. A replacement of the radiator grate that rattled. A designer's critique of Gabriela's portfolio. Kind, practical assistance without spectacle. He never once offered to buy them out of their difficulty. He offered to be present in ways that implied no ownership. That evening, after Anne went to bed with her train parked like a sentinel on the bedside table, Gabriela and Thales sat with 2 cups of tea. The conversation took on a softer cadence. There was no impulse to fill silences with explanation. Rather, they let the quiet sit between them like a measured breath. Gabriela found herself telling him about the work she'd been trying to make time for, the posters she designed for local community centers, the classes where she experimented with color. Thales listened, sometimes asking a quiet question that let him see the edges of her world more clearly. He told her, in small, steady sentences, about the loneliness of being in a house that gleamed but sometimes felt like an elegant, empty stage. He spoke of decisions he had made and the cost of certainty, how success can be a mechanical thing that shrinks the space for tenderness if one is not careful to cultivate it. When he spoke of his own loss, a marriage that had dissolved in parts neither of them wanted to name, his voice did not dramatize. Instead, he said, "I know how to keep things," and Gabriela heard more than furniture in that claim. She began to understand the shape of his caution. They spoke about what it meant, now and perhaps later, to be careful with one another. Gabriela told him how hard it was to trust, not because she doubted his words, but because she had learned to measure every kindness against the ledger of consequence. "I don't want my daughter to be part of a story where we get promises and then wake up and they're gone," she said, the sentence honest and brittle at the edges. "I need people who stay in the small, concrete ways." Thales did not flinch. He did not offer dramatic vows. Instead, he said, "I can show up for the small things." He named a few specific actions: a visit next week to help fix a leaky cabinet, a call on Wednesdays to check how the design class was going, an invitation to lunch without expectation beyond the meal. He spoke like someone describing measures he could actually take, rather than poetic commitments he could not keep. There was a steadiness in his list that Gabriela found both infuriating and oddly soothing. She wanted to ask for things she had not known how to ask for, and now someone was offering particularities, not platitudes. At dusk, as they folded blankets over his shoulders and Anne's sighs became the outer rhythm of sleep, Thales stood to go. He hesitated at the door and then turned back. "May I?" he asked. "May you what?" Gabriela asked, wary of wishes and vulnerable to meaning. "May I say a word of thanks for tonight?" he said. He looked small for a moment, like someone remembering the right shape for a ritual he had not practiced in a while. Gabriela could have refused on principle, but something in the way he framed the question, simple, genuine, without expectation, made her nod. "Yes," she said. He gathered his hands together as if in the manner of a fleeting private ceremony and spoke in the hush of the hallway. His prayer was short and inclusive, a soft declaration of gratitude for warmth at a table, for the laughter of children, for chances to be kinder. He asked, without flamboyance, that the coming days be gentle and that those at the table might be given grace to stay present to one another. It was a prayer that found no dogma, no grand promise, only a quiet asking for help to be better, for courage to keep the small obligations that build a life. After he left, Gabriela remained at the door for a while, feeling the faint echo of his voice recede like a tide. She thought of how odd it felt to have a prayer acknowledged by a stranger, and how intimate that acknowledgement could be. She thought of Anne asleep upstairs, of the train parked like a small guarded hope. She pulled her coat close and went back inside. There were gestures the next morning that seemed to confirm the truth of the previous day without pushing their shape too far. Thales sent, through Andre, a neatly wrapped envelope containing a small set of professional markers and a voucher to a printing repair. Lab.
things that spoke to Gabriela's design work and suggested he had listened when she had been too timid to hope someone might. He refused to call the gift anything but practical. "For your work," he wrote on a note that smelled faintly of cologne and something cleaner, like the paper of intentions. Gabriela's hands trembled when she opened the parcel. There was no fanfare, no expectation, just a recognition. She sat down at the table and arranged the markers as if they were tools she had been granted permission to use. For the first time in many nights, she let herself imagine a day when her work might be more than a consolation prize for time she could not protect. But along with small mercies came the necessary questions. What did it mean to let someone into their life? How would acceptance of help change the rhythms Gabriela had constructed out of fear and determination? She could see the edge of dependence as clearly as she could the bridge of partnership. She had seen, before, people who used their wallet as a substitute for intimacy. She had vowed never to confuse ease for affection. There was nothing in Thalus's gestures that seemed like buying or smoothing. Instead, they showed the awkwardness of someone learning to be tender on terms others would accept. That was not the same as assuming authority. It was humility disguised as competency. Anne, for her part, took to calling Thalus Papa in a way that felt bold and innocent. The nickname started as a private joke, then became a blunt instrument to test boundaries. Gabriela corrected it gently when needed, but she did not forbid it. She noticed a change in her own chest, the feeling that maybe a person could be both unknown and reliable, that someone might enter their small orbit and not make it collapse. The days that followed were a study in recalibration. Thalus arrived on a Wednesday and stayed for coffee while helping Gabriela sand a loose shelf. He knocked on the door before coming in and texted to ask if there was a decent time to call. He did practical things, mending a leaky pipe with a pragmatic humor that acknowledged his status without making bills a bargain. He read Anne's stories, sitting on the floor with the child at his knees, and his voice grew tender with practice. He made small, careful errors and then corrected them as he learned. Gabriela watched, sometimes with impatience, sometimes with a reluctant soft approval. She measured him against every standard she had devised to keep herself safe from disappointment. He met most of them. Where he failed, he apologized without making excuses. That mattered to her in a way that startled her. She had assumed gestures would be enough, that actions could reduce the risk of being hurt. But it turned out that the ability to say "I'm sorry" and mean it was a rarer currency than she'd imagined. A turning point arrived without pyrotechnics. Anne asked one night, with a seriousness that was almost legalistic in its precision, whether Thales would be at the table when she blew out her birthday candles in the spring. Gabriela felt a jolt. Birthdays were private rituals she guarded fiercely. But she also noticed, with the unflinching logic of mothering, how much these small shared moments mattered. Thales answered with a simplicity that steadied her. "Yes, if you'll have me." He did not promise to be all things. He promised presence. The climax of what began as a whimsical request in a square occurred not in a single dramatic act, but in a series of mutual admissions. Gabriela confessed once, late at night, that she was afraid, not only of being hurt, but of losing herself in a life shaped by someone else's decisions. Thales confessed that he had been afraid of seeming weak, of letting the habit of perfection mask the need for human connection. Both admitted to loneliness. Both admitted to hope. Those confessions landed with the weight of adult currency, the kind that buys steady, imperfect companionship rather than theatrical romance. They did not move in together. They did not declare eternal intentions. Instead, they orchestrated a small set of rituals. Shared lunches, a Wednesday call, a weekend where he would help with a repair and then leave to let them keep their home intact. He paid for nothing she had not asked him to, and when he offered gifts, they were thoughtful and practical. A printing voucher, a set of professional markers, a repair on the streetlight outside her building that had flickered for months. He replaced an old scarf that had once belonged to her mother with a similar one. Not expensive, but soft and meaningful. Each action carried attention.
The brooch, which Gabriela pinned to her coat after the first lunch, became a private emblem of dignity. She did not wear it to impress others. She wore it because it reminded her, privately, of being seen. The train, which Anne insisted on running every evening from the bookshelf to the kitchen and back, became a tiny ritual that stitched their evenings together. The story did not sweep into a tidy fairy tale. There were arguments, often around the edges of comfort zones. Gabriela's resistance to accepting help, Thail's occasional tendency to make decisions without consulting her. They navigated it with the fumbled grace of adults learning to fit another life like a new pair of shoes. Slowly, carefully, sometimes pinched, often warming with wear. One evening, as snow fell thick and steady, Gabriela found herself standing at the window watching the city soften. Anne had been tucked in hours before. The radiator hummed its familiar, obstinate song. Thales was supposed to come the next day for their weekly repair and lunch ritual. Gabriela's mind drifted to a future that had no guarantees but contained possible continuity. It was not blissful. It held practical worries, bills, school projects, the slow arc of a design career. But it also contained a
New, patient possibility that someone could show up repeatedly without erosion of self, that presence could be a better medicine than grand gestures. She turned from the window as a knock sounded at the door. Dallas stood there with a small box in his hands, a look on his face that mixed nervousness and something approximating hope. He apologized for arriving unexpectedly and then offered the box without fanfare. Inside was a small toolkit, vintage perhaps, with a leather roll and a set of tools polished in a way that suggested care. For fixing things you live with, he said, and for everything you design that needs a steady hand. Gabriela felt the absurdly tender impulse to laugh and cry at once. A toolkit was a practical object, but it was also a pact of sorts. A way of saying, I want to help keep your world steady. She accepted it with the gratitude of someone who had been given not rescue, but the means to keep building. Later, around the small table where they sometimes ate, they shared a brief prayer, Dallas leading this time, his voice low and inclusive. He gave thanks for the warmth of the apartment, for Anne's laughter, for the honest labor that put food on their table. He asked only for courage to be present and for the humility to respect one another's boundaries. It was a prayer of ordinary things, simple, domestic, without doctrine. Gabriela felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. They did not come from religion so much as from relief that someone else could recognize the gravity of small obligations and commit to them. When Anne, unprompted, crawled up and hugged them both as if the world had condensed into the warmth at that table, Gabriela let herself relax. She mouthed a small thank you into Thail's shoulder and felt with a soft astonishment that she might be willing to let someone in a little more each day. The night closed on them quietly. No grand declaration had been made, no finality announced. There was instead a sequence of small promises, visits, repairs, calls that formed the shape of a beginning. Gabriela did not imagine a fairy tale ending. She imagined a day-by-day effort. That image felt truer to her than any sudden rescue. Outside, the snow fell like a new language, covering old footprints but leaving the ones they made together. Inside, the light on the tiny tree blinked steadily, and for the first time in a long time, Gabriela let herself believe that hope could be practical, and that love could be built on things as ordinary as a repaired shelf, a small toy train, and the shared habit of showing up. The next morning would bring small tasks and ordinary questions. Would he come for lunch again? Would they manage the bills that month? Would Anne ask him to be a father in the way children do, messy and persistent? Those questions did not have tidy answers yet, but they sat on the table like unfinished sketches, promises to be drawn in further lines. For now, there was the quiet comfort of a table cleared, a toy train parked like a sentinel, and a brooch pinned close to the heart. There was an invitation to patience. There was no guarantee, only a beginning measured in concrete gestures. The winter streets were full of lights that morning, and somewhere in the square a pianist struck a note that trembled with familiar, fragile hope. Gabriela wrapped her coat around herself and felt not certainty, but a willingness that was almost the same. She would hold to the small things, and she would watch how someone else held to them too. The rest could wait. They walked toward the bistro a few blocks from Gabriela's building, with Anne between them, small mittened fists slipping into each of their hands like an anchor. The city had been scrubbed overnight. The snow that had fallen the day before lay in soft ridges along the curbs, and the air had the clear, serrated cold that makes voices sound kinder. Thales walked with a cautious briskness, hands mostly in his pockets, the toolkit slung at his side like something both practical and strangely ceremonial. Gabriela found herself watching him the way she used to watch drafts on a page, not searching for a fix so much as measuring whether tension and texture held together. They ordered sandwiches and soup. The lunch ritual kept its gentle choreography. Anne ate with fierce concentration, talking between chews about a cardboard castle she wanted to build that afternoon. Thales asked questions about spaces, about where shelves might go, about where Anne's drawings could live without getting trampled. He listened as if he believed the answers mattered, and Gabriela liked that, liked the way he treated ordinary items as if they were invitations rather than burdens. When the soup arrived, it steamed in the cold light, and they fell into a comfortable silence. Gabriela folded a napkin and watched the small domestic economy of the table, bread passing across hands, Anne demonstrating how to slide a cup safely, Thales tucking a stray curl behind Anne's ear as she told them a story she had invented about a penguin who knitted mittens. The sound of the city filtered in, shoes on pavement, an argument in the next block that resolved and became laughter, and Gabriela felt for a sliver of time that the things she had been guarding could be shared. Later, back in the apartment, Thales suggested they tackle the wobbly shelf in Anne's room. It was a bad job. 2 screw holes stripped, a veneer that came away like scabbed skin. But with his small hammer and screwdriver and the little leather roll he had brought, he set to work with the quiet patience of someone repairing something one expects to still use. Anne perched on the bed and narrated the operation in earnest. Gabriela sat on the floor and unpacked a box of model trains that had been neglected since the move 2 years before, finding couplings and tiny chewed tracks that had been rescued from a shoebox. Repair work has a clarity Gabriela often envied. There is a problem, you understand its shape, there are materials, there is one or more techniques, there is the possibility of immediate improvement. It is not like hiring or pitching or waiting for a grant, those things that stretched and thinned into indefinite timelines. The shelf was an enactment of an ethic. We can keep our world from falling apart, slowly, together. Thales smiled when a new screw set took the shelf rigidly upright. There, he said, as if the verb could hold all the domestic theology they both practiced. Anne clapped. Gabriela pressed her forehead to his shoulder for a second, a small, unadvertised gratitude. "Thank you," she said, and it was the kind of sentence that meant more than the words because it could be counted, small deposits into a shared account. They talked later about practicalities with a looseness that surprised her. Not declarations, but lists. When they could split babysitting, which errands each would take, how to coordinate payment for weekend daycare. There were boundaries, too. Gabriela told him plainly that she needed to know when he would be present and when he would not. That consistency mattered more to her than grand gestures. Thales answered that he understood and that he would do his best. He did not offer a vow wrapped in rhetoric. He offered calendars and a plan. Work called in ways both good and complicated. A message came through her email while the kettle boiled. A small studio in the next city wanted her to consult on an exhibit design. A week of concentrated work that could make a noticeable dent in her savings. The timing was inconvenient but not impossible. She felt the chop of fear and opportunity, an old oscillation that had once driven her to take jobs and move cities, to sacrifice stability for momentum.
She thought of Anne, of the routines they had just started to stitch, and of Thalus's steady presence. Thalus saw the email over her shoulder and exhaled softly. "Maybe you should go," he said, matter of fact. His voice carried no claim on her choice. Gabriela surprised herself by answering quickly. "Maybe," she echoed, "but I don't want to leave Anne without a plan." They arranged possibilities. Thalus could take some of the week for the mornings, a neighbor could cover afternoons, she could cut days. The negotiation was pragmatic, not dramatic. It felt, in its way, like a test neither of them wanted to make heavy. That evening, they sat cross-legged on the rug with Anne between them and made a list in a childish, colorful handwriting. Schedules, phone numbers, where the spare key would be. Anne drew stars next to each item. The smallness of it, phones, trains, nap times, was the same thing as faith. The necessary particulars that produce constancy. Weeks became a cadence. Thalus came on Wednesdays and brought small repairs, large patients, and a thermos of coffee in winter or a bottle of lemon soda in summer. He showed up without being asked for things like replacing light bulbs, tightening a loose door hinge, and occasionally, quietly, bringing a casserole when Gabriela was too exhausted to cook. On the days he was not there, he called. He sent pictures of a lamp he'd found at a flea market that reminded him of the one Gabriela liked. He did not propose, he did not ask for permission to live inside the shape of her life. He offered presence and then retreated when she needed space. Anne adapted. Children are honest in the business of testing. One minute they accept a new person as if it is the most natural turnover in the world, the next they engineer dramas to measure the edges of attention. Sometimes Anne clung, sometimes she pushed. Gabriela learned to read the difference between a child's need for comfort and a child's desire to explore the boundaries of fear. There were evenings when Anne asked whether Thalus was staying, and Gabriela answered with the same kind of cautious clarity she used elsewhere. "He is here for dinner this week," she said. She told the truth about the limits she set. The little framework of expectations calmed Anne more consistently than grand reassurances would have. Work continued its quiet demand. Gabriela accepted the week-long consultancy and left with a backpack and a small thrill that came from being needed for her craft. She stepped off the train with a sense that life could hold both small domestic attentions and larger professional ones. Thalus stayed at the apartment while she was away, and they exchanged messages like people learning a new, careful language. Photos of Anne making a crown from paper plates, notes about a cracked tile in the bathroom, a short, exacted line. "I tightened the shelf. All good." When she returned, Anne ran to her at the station and launched herself into a practiced, wholehearted reunion. Gabriela held her and felt at once fortunate and exhausted, the familiar tangle of motherhood and ambition. Thalus was there to meet them on the platform with the toolkit and a small bouquet of tulips in a scratched jar. People who loved one another can become predictable gestures. Thalus's bouquet felt like punctuation to the sentence of their week. There were, of course, small ruptures. An electricity bill arrived more substantial than expected because of a faulty radiator sensor, and for a week Gabriela tracked every kilowatt like a guilty accountant. She found herself short on the day Thalus's landlord called about a shared expense he had mistakenly presumed covered. A meeting at the school to discuss Anne's progress coincided with a late client call. These were not catastrophes. They were a reminder that the architecture of an ordinary life is engineered of many little tolerances. When things tilted, they required simple recalibration. On one late spring afternoon, after a day of tight deadlines and an evening of housework, Gabriela and Thale sat on the stoop and drank cheap beer from a paper bag. Anne chased a neighbor's cat under the eaves and came back with grass in her cuffs and a story about a fairy who lived behind a radiator. They spoke quietly about the future in the way people who are not yet married talk, the hypothetical tone, the sorting of preferences and fears. Thale said he liked the idea of a small garden on the fire escape. Gabriela admitted she feared the maintenance. They laughed about trying to grow tomatoes and failing spectacularly, as though domestic competence were a science experiment they were conducting together.
"I don't need to be married to be committed," Thale said at one point, staring at the skyline in the way people look when trying to think of a weather pattern. He meant it plainly, an argument, not a refusal. Gabriela knew she did not want vows as much as she wanted someone who could keep showing up. She looked at Anne, asleep in a sling that night as they walked home, and felt how central the question of attachment had become. Not whether love would arrive in incandescent blasts, but whether it would compile, week after week, into something durable. There were evenings when Gabriela lay awake and thought of the life she had led before Anne, of relationships that had been thrilling in their instability and then dissolved into versions of themselves she hardly recognized. She did not romanticize loneliness anymore, but neither did she naively accept a smooth horizon. The years had taught her to value both passion and predictability. Thale seemed to understand the value of both as well, which was perhaps why their tentative pattern felt neither stifling nor reckless. Winter turned again, and with it new rituals. They celebrated small holidays together, not as a family in the traditional sense, but as a cluster of people who had chosen one another for unostentatious reasons. They traded books and recipes. Thales learned to make Anne's favorite pancakes with a deliberate clumsiness that made everyone laugh. Gabriela learned to ask for help before the moment of collapse, and when she did, Thales sometimes surprised her by saying yes. A fissure opened, though, not with grand drama, but in the banal arithmetic of an unremarkable Tuesday. Gabriela found, during a quiet moment when the child napped and the apartment hummed, an unsigned envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a letter from a design consortium in Europe interested in her portfolio, an offer to exhibit across 3 cities over the summer, a fellowship with a modest stipend, and obligations that would require near-constant travel for 2 months. It was everything a person in her profession might crave: visibility, an invitation to make a larger body of work, the kind of momentum that could yield long-term contracts. She did not bring the letter out at once. She read it twice, then left it on the kitchen counter and went about the small housekeeping of her day, as if waiting to make the thought solid might muffle its force. The next night she placed it before Thales and Anne. Anne drew stars on the margins in a declaration of support she did not have the words to articulate. Thales read the letter slowly, like someone reading a blueprint for a structure he liked but did not wholly understand. "It would be good for you," he said finally, not without warmth. He sat very still, which was his way of thinking aloud when he had to balance practicality and feeling. "It's the sort of thing that could change everything for your work." But he also said, "I'll miss you. Anne will too. We'll manage." "We'll manage," Gabriela repeated, because there was truth in the sentence and a question mark she could not ignore. She imagined scenes of departures, trains, airport security, Anne's small face pressed to a window, the calendar dotted with empty squares. She also imagined the doors the invitation might open: residencies, collaborators, a chance to build a portfolio that might reduce the recurring anxieties about work and money. The offer arrived as a fork placed between 2 necessary goods. They negotiated the shape of it with the same practical tenderness they had used on the shelf. There were questions of financing, childcare, and the rhythms of travel. They spoke about whether Thales could take extra days during the week, whether a neighbor might cover weekends, whether Gabriela could compress her work into stretches and be home for important family days. The talk was less about loyalty than about logistics, but logistics are the scaffolding on which fidelity is often built. In the end, Gabriela decided to accept the offer. It was the kind of professional risk she had trained herself to take at precisely the moments when it might not feel perfectly convenient. She and Thales drew a plan. They scheduled a trial run, a short trip to a regional fair to see how Anne responded to being cared for by Thales full-time for a few days. They revised budgets. There were moments of awkwardness, of logistics misread and then corrected, of doubt turned into action. And, as children do, adapted quickly, her chief criteria being whether she had enough stickers and whether bedtime stories remained the same. Their lives rearranged without catastrophe. The week Gabriela left was taught with goodbyes that were simple and real. A kiss at the station, a careful hug for Anne, an extra thermos of coffee tucked into her bag.
Thales waved her off and then drove home with Anne singing in the back seat about the penguin who wanted to build a house. On the other side of the trip, Gabriela discovered the precise ecology of trust. It was not only that Thales could carry their domestic world when she was gone, it was that in carrying it, he made choices that enlarged the thing they were building. He took Anne to the library on a whim and returned with an armful of picture books. He taped a loose tile in the kitchen and took a picture for her to see. He left small notes on the fridge, observations, jokes, a list of things he'd repaired. Each note was a small ledger entry in the account of their shared labor. When she returned from the fellowship, the changes were not seismic but palpable. Gabriela's name came up in conversations at the studio in a new way. An editor asked for an interview. A gallery made a tentative query. The money they had saved in the small months of economizing allowed them to think about replacing the broken radiator sensor without catastrophe. Thales received a small bonus at work for a repair he had suggested that saved his employer money. He used part of it to buy a new pair of pliers and an old copy of a book Gabriela had once mentioned. They did not declare themselves a family in neat terms. The label slipped between them without being pinned down. Sometimes it was practical, sometimes it was tender, sometimes it was absent entirely. They continued to make lists and calibrate days and say thank you. They learned to make promises that fit the workaday hours, not grand promises, just the kind that could be trusted because they could be measured. There were nights when Gabriela still woke with the pull of old anxieties, the knowledge that nothing in life is permanent, the awareness that people change, that someone kind today might become someone indifferent tomorrow. But those nights were fewer. More and more often she woke with the residual warmth of having been chosen in small ways. A sandwich saved on the kitchen counter, a note in a pocket, a repaired hinge. On a late autumn afternoon, as the light grew thin and the city readied itself for another snowfall, Thales and Gabriela sat at the small table and made a list of things to fix before winter fully arrived. Storm windows, the garden pots, a loose step on the stoop. Anne painted a picture of a house with many doors, and Gabriela pinned it to the refrigerator with a magnet. The list was modest, domestic, and finite. It was all the faith they required. That life could be made safer by attention, that love could be measured in actions repeated. They closed the notebook and cleared the table. Gabriela placed her hand over Thales for a second, not as a plea, but as an acknowledgement. He squeezed back, gentle, sure. And for a moment the city outside seemed to contract to the size of their apartment, held by the same physics that kept the shelf upright and the train running. They did not pretend to know the shape of their future in detail. They only knew the trajectory of small futures made by consistent acts. A repaired shelf, a cooked meal, a call answered at bedtime. It was not the
End of anything. There would be more bills and more opportunities, brief quarrels over trivialities, and evenings when one of them would need the other in a way the other could not provide. But the small scaffold of attention they had built was real. It did what scaffolds are meant to do. It allowed them to work on the building without fearing collapse. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. Not the heavy, settling kind, but the fine dust that suggests winter without yet claiming it. Anne ran to the window and pressed her forehead to the glass, making a small child smear of breath. Thales rose and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, then turned to Gabriela and offered a hand to help her up. She took it without hesitation. They stood together at the window, watching the city soften and the footprints accumulate, both old and new. It had become, for them, not a singular miracle, but a daily craft. They had begun, in small ways, to hold one another's edges. And for now, that was enough to keep the shelves upright and the trains running.